Hello and welcome to another episode of Retropower Uncut. Unusually you find me actually in a car. I'm going to go through what James has been doing on the Project Untitled Jaguar, but I thought it was also a great opportunity to show some of the construction of the interior, maybe do a little feature on it. So at the moment what James is actually working on is the side panels for the centre console and the back section here. So it's literally just going to be an MDF panel down the side, upholstered in leather, and then the section around the back will be a curved shaped piece that's 3D printed and upholstered in leather. The only significant details really on those is that we'll put a groove down the centre of the edge all the way around that panel, so that when we do the leather on it we can actually sit the back of the seam in. So if you see on the dash here, for instance, this French seam as they call it, where you get the two layers of leather coming together, you end up with some material on the back, and you can obviously either flip it one way or you can flip it the other way, but that tends to leave a bump underneath one side or the other of the seam. What you can also do is cut the back of that excess really short, so you just end up with a very, very small bump on the back, but obviously it does bulge the seam up in the middle. So usually wherever we're upholstering something with a French seam, either on the material itself or in the foam that's underneath it, we'll do a little groove to sit the back of that seam into. So I thought I'd just take the opportunity to go into some of this in more detail. So this essentially is a complete blank canvas, clean slate interior design job. There literally isn't any standard Jaguar parts in any of this dash and console. When we did the fabrication on the shell, all of the bulkhead area and the tunnel area at the front there was refabricated from scratch. So we could incorporate a decent modern aircon and heating system, and also everything else that needed to go behind the dash. So all the electronic systems, the audio control systems, the screen that's in the dash, etc., etc. And everything's been built around that. So as an example, the dash top has been fabricated in aluminium. That's a rolled formed piece that comes around. The vents on the top were drawn in CAD and machined from billet. And then anodised. Obviously the dash top's been upholstered, foamed and then leathered. The dash fascia panels are all aluminium as well. So these have been handmade and then prepped, painted with a base colour, which is like a deepish brown. And then the wood grain's actually been hydrographically transferred on there, which is, a few people have asked about this before when I've talked about it. It's basically a transfer that you float on the surface of a tank of water. And that then allows you to very nicely wrap it around any three-dimensional object. Now these are actually relatively two-dimensional anyway, but that's the process that's been used. And we tend to do that on a lot of the wood finishes we do inside, because the quality, when it's done properly, is so good, and it allows you to use different materials. So actually, for instance, these cappings on here are actually wood, but we've still hydro printed them with the same pattern, but it means we were able to make some of the components in aluminium, which is just a much more accurate material to work with. So for instance, if we look at the console here, around all these edges is a really accurate chamfer, which has been machined in there. So this piece here, for example, this fascia panel, that entire assembly was drawn in CAD. The fascia panel was then flattened out in CAD, waterjet profile to cut the actual blank for it. Then a milling machine was used to cut all the chamfers into it, and then that's then been prepared and hydro printed with the wood grain finish. Underneath this fascia panel there's a billet machined piece, which you can see the edges of in this recess here, and this face here is also that same piece, and that's been machined and then black anodised. Then underneath that, sandwiched into the mounting plate, which is this black steel fabricated piece here, there are two 3D printed parts. One of them holds this charger and has the leather on the top of it there. The other one holds this leather insert here, but also holds these keypads into the top fascia panel, and these are for the audio controls for the Alpine audio and nav system. And then this bezel here was machined in aluminium and then polished. At the front here, there's a flat aluminium panel that these switches are all mounted into. That was waterjet cut, black anodised, and then the various lettering symbols around the switches were all lasered in. And likewise with these switches, they're called chicken head switches, always amuses me. They're off-the-shelf plastic switches, but then with the laser settings just right, we've been able to laser in the lettering and then carefully infill it with white paint. So the function of the switches is actually on the switch themselves. This is the control panel for the heating and aircon. It's a vintage air system. We tend to use a lot of their systems. I think this is one of the slightly smaller ones, so it's Gen 2 I think they're called. The gauges were custom made as well. They were made by Classic Instruments in the States, so we basically did some basic artwork for how we wanted them to look. I threw a few ideas back and forth. They did some renderings for us of how they interpreted that. We tweaked and changed a few details on them until we were happy, and then they made them exactly to our specification. A lot of Rolls-Royce influence on those, so the backwards operating speedo that kind of goes underneath rather than over the top. And also the little red ends on the needles is a bit of a reminiscent of some of the sort of Bentleys and Rollses of the 50s. This lower panel again, handmade in aluminium, foamed and then leathered with a French seam around it. The vents are actually from a company called Resto Mod Air in the States, who I guess they're a competitor to Vintage Air. Some of their stuff is a bit nicer, particularly the vents. They've got a really nice range of machined vents, which, although expensive, do add a really nice finishing touch. So yeah, that's a quick overview of the interior in Utah. We'll move on to what we've been doing on the Vader Chevette. So Scott's working on this at the minute. Over the course of the last week, he's basically been buttoning up everything behind the dash with a view to getting the dash in. So the wiring loom needed quite a bit of work shuffling around because there's a lot of wiring behind the dash to try and get it reasonably out of view. It's one thing that is a bit more challenging on a motorsport build because there's no interior panel work to cover everything. The wiring needs to be really neat, otherwise it's kind of a bit of an eyesore. So he's been working on that. He's been getting the wiper motor connected up and the linkage on because that's all behind the dash. On these, the spindles are in the engine, on the scuttle obviously, but they go through the bulkhead and the mechanism is behind the dash and then the motor's actually in the engine bay. It's a bit of a strange arrangement. So the motor's in the engine bay with the spindle going through the bulkhead. The linkage is all behind the dash and then the spindles themselves come back out onto the scuttle. So he's been getting all the linkage connected up behind there. He's been mounting the GPS sensor for the speedo, and he's just about to wire in the isolator button, which is the one remaining job electrically on the dash before he can actually get that in. So hopefully later today that's going to be going in. As a quick recap, it's essentially a standard Chevette dash that we've had flocked. A few people asked about flocking as well when I mentioned that before. So if you're not familiar with that process, it's basically spraying an adhesive, which is usually dyed the colour that you want the flock to be, onto the whatever it is you're covering, and then you spray electrically charged nylon fibres, which because they're statically charged, they stand on end and stick into the adhesive and basically create almost like a velvety sort of finish, which is quite common in motorsport stuff. And it's just quite a nice way of giving a nice even matte looking finish to an interior component. So that should hopefully go in later today. We've also just received the steering wheel, which I've been waiting I think 3 or 4 months for. So I can't wait to see that on because we've had this scruffy old Irmscher steering wheel in it for months now, and it'd be nice to see the final one in there. So hopefully we'll see that in there later today. New Adam, this is going to get confusing because there's 2 now, has been working on the Mustang. So this was on sort of paused for a while, and now we're kind of into the next round of progress on this car and a couple of others. So it's really coming together quite nicely. He's been focusing on the door build, so he's been getting the latches in, the handles in. He's just working on getting the quarter glasses in, also the rear quarter light assemblies. Yesterday he got the gutter trims on. Because this car was, as I've mentioned before, was basically delivered to us as just a bare shell, with us to just do the metalwork and paint it, and then only later was it then changed to being us doing the full build on it, and the customers supplied, in theory, all the parts new, but of course a lot of our work is working out what parts actually aren't there, because you tend to find, although you go through the parts websites of the companies that supply parts for these cars, you can tick every box, but there's still quite a lot of things that aren't reproduced, particularly nuts and bolts and that sort of thing. So quite a lot of our work is sort of digging out the parts, offering them up and working out what parts we don't have, and then speccing nuts and bolts to suit, which can be quite a time-consuming process, particularly when we've not worked on one of these before. But Adam's doing well, he's getting through it, so looking forward to seeing this continue to transform over the next few weeks. Follow me this way. We have now just about resolved our courier issues with the merchandise stuff, so do feel free to go and order some stuff. We've just restocked the t-shirts and hoodies. The mugs are going to be back in stock on, I think, the 23rd of November now. So you should be able to order a mug in time for Christmas as well. Right. So Tom has been on with the Land Cruiser. I think that sort of showed that he was just starting the seats. I said the rear seats, but actually the front seats last week. So he's working on the seat frame. What we're basically doing on this is using Land Rover seat bases just as a basis to give us something to work with, because they're roughly the right size. The owner wanted pretty much a bench seat. Although it is made of three individual seats, but they kind of go together like a bench. It needs to have the functionality to fold flat, so that you can get in the back, because we're going to have a crossways rear bench seat as well. Now you will have to climb over the front seat, but it's only for essentially the owner's children in the back anyway. But we do need the front seat back to fold flat onto the front seat base, so it can't be very three-dimensional. It's got to be a reasonably flat profiled seat. So starting with the Land Rover seat made a lot of sense. It will be reupholstered in the owner's choice of material. But Tom was basically making the frames that will hold those seats. There's going to be a bar running across the front here. There'll be closing panels that enclose all of the fuel tank area in and basically create a platform that the seats will sit onto. He's currently forming the actual frames that the seat bases themselves sit into, and those frames will then sit onto sliding runners on top of the main base underneath. And we're going to split it in two, so the middle and passenger seat will slide as one and the driver's seat will slide separately. And likewise the folding will be separate as well, so because the rear part of the driver's seat, when folded, will most likely hit the steering wheel anyway, so it means you can fold the whole of the rest of the seat forward, and that gives you quite easy access into the back then. So yeah, he's just on with that at the minute. George is on with the hinges. So last week he was working on the rear door hinges. If you look at this side, he's got some 3D prints in place now. I think I mentioned before about the fact that the original kind of swaged over pin design is not overly serviceable. So we wanted to come up with a better system that uses a shoulder bolt and bronze bushes in the hinge itself. So it takes any play out of there. We also wanted a little bit more adjustability, so we've done lateral slots in this main mount here, so you can move the doors in and out significantly, because originally it was just a round hole. There was no adjustment on the rear doors at all. So that's looking really good. One tiny tweak to make, which is always the purpose of 3D printing stuff. On this lower hinge, I noticed that the back part of the black bit here actually touches the body slightly when you close it, so we're just going to chamfer that in slightly on the final design. And then leading on from that, we thought, well, if we're doing the rear door hinges, it probably makes sense to make everything matching. It would be nice to have some decent quality hinges elsewhere, so he's working on a design for the door hinges as well at the minute. And then there's a question mark then over whether we go the whole hog and do the bonnet hinges and the windscreen mount hinges as well, but we'll get the door hinges done and then make a decision from there. So looking forward to seeing the seat arrangement take shape over the next week or so. The Jag, we stripped down last week. That's awaiting blasting. Stu is just making the spit ends for it. So they're the brackets that will bolt to the shell to mount it onto the rotisserie. So we can roll it over, and we'll initially do a burn session on it which will just be a blowtorch burn on the underside to get any sort of heavy sealer and underseal off it. Then it'll be going in our blast room over there and to be blasted, and we'll see what horrors await. At the moment, as it stands at the minute, I still think it's pretty good. No doubt Jamie will just afflict a frame of a nail in there again, probably. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing that and what sort of condition it's in and getting stuck into the project. The Morris, which is just lurking over there, big change since last week. Last week was basically the culmination of the dry build on it. So I think it was sat here, completely built up mechanically. Stu was happy with everything metalwork wise. So over the course of the last week, he's been stripping that back down. The shell's just completely bare now on the ramp over there. All the running gear's out. The front and rear subframes are on a pallet over there, which is shortly going to be taken next door. So we can start disassembling that. We'll get the main subframe components blasted and start ordering up all the parts to rebuild it. So things like the bushes and ball joints and all the wearing replaceable parts, we'll get all those ordered up so we can get the subframes rebuilt in the background while the guys are working on prepping and painting the body shell. And on subject of prepping and painting, the CV8's progressing really well. So over the sort of recent weeks, the guys have essentially been working on improving the standard of fit and finish of everything, reworking the skirts, etc. Now we're on with some of the more creative stuff, so we've made a start on the quarter panel reshaping at the back. We're bringing the quarters out a couple of inches to make the car slightly wider at the back. A, because we want to get some bigger rubber in there because it's going to be extremely powerful, and B, we just want to make it look a bit more muscular. So essentially, all of the work we're doing at the minute, because this is only essentially being used as a book to take a mould from, it's fairly rough and ready. It's basically just ragging stuff around, smashing body filler in everywhere. There's wood screws and wood involved. It's pretty rough and ready work. So Gaz has basically jacked that quarter out, slit it in lots of places so we could get it to a curve, propped it out with bits of wood. He's now in the process of fiberglassing and filling that back in, and it's going to be just lots of filler sculpting until we get the shape how we want it to be. Another change at the front is the little indicator and side light units. We'd always planned to get rid of those, so they've now been deleted. We've covered over the original air intakes at the bottom, which were kind of a rectangular shape and didn't look overly in keeping with the design of the car. And we want to get slightly more air intake area at the bottom there because we're going to be covering the headlights, which also have a small air intake. All of those intakes lead to the cabin air intake for the heating system. So we wanted to enlarge the lower ones to compensate for the fact that we're covering up the higher ones. So what you can see at the bottom there, the black, we've just painted on a rough outline of how we want those vents to be. And Steve will probably cut those out shortly. Then maybe further down the line we might make a little billet bezel for those. That's undecided at the moment. And then what the guys are literally working on at the minute is the rear window. So we're switching over to having flush bonded glass on it to give it a slightly more modern look. We've probably talked before about the fact it's having a glass panoramic roof, but at the minute we're altering the body to bring it back to the profile of the original rear glass, but without the seal gap. So they've essentially just set the position of the rear window to bring it flush with the body, put a trim around it to add a little bit of size to add our sort of adhesive gap, and then literally just body fill it all around it. They're in the process of probably trying to cut that out at the minute, and then there'll be a load of work to perfect that aperture so that the glass is a nice fit into the aperture. Again, not much attention needs to be paid to the inside of it because all this is going to be used for is then a book to take a mould from to make the new body. So the only thing that really matters at this stage is the shape of the outer finish and it being nice, flat, uniform and a decent standard of finish on the outside of the car. But all the B surfaces, they won't have a mould taken from them, so it doesn't really matter. So yeah, we're kind of at the exciting bit really where we see the changes take shape. So I'm looking forward to the next couple of weeks on that. Hopefully see those rear quarters take shape, and we'll catch up with that again next week. We'll see you then.
The vanes as well. You know, you can't just have a bare shaft. Oh yeah, vanes. Do a throbbing vane. Oh, there we go. Ah. Excellent. Wanks is in the building.